Hello, everyone. It's Mr. Huffman. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're watching this. Today, as we're still moving through the Great Divide, we're going to stop a little bit and talk about the war with Mexico, or the Mexican American War. And in many ways, it's going to be kind of spurred out of the tensions between the U.S. and Mexico for U.S.'s kind of support. And it wasn't ever large support, but it was kind of support of some funds, some people, but especially kind of the morale behind kind of the war for Texas independence, right? That Texas had, where a lot of former Americans had kind of tried to create their own little nation of sorts. Mexico obviously didn't like that because it was kind of on their territory. Then that Texas War for Independence's fault. Texas wins, and Mexico is going to lose a lot of that land in Texas. So a lot of the strains between us and Mexico go back to that. But also, Mexico during this time sees itself as kind of another version of America, right? Because America had defeated the British, warded them off, these kind of colonial oppressors from Europe. The Mexicans had did the same thing just some years before against the Spanish. So they kind of saw themselves as kind of not necessarily our cousin exactly, but in some ways inspired by us. But now they're going to find themselves within our crosshairs, and we're going to find us within their crosshairs. Okay, so again, territorial disputes between Mexico went all the way back, actually, even before that, to 1803, when U.S. claimed Texas was part of that Louisiana Purchase. Now, this was still while the Spanish controlled Mexico, but even the Mexicans there felt resentment towards U.S. trying to take part of Texas and say, "Oh, that's part of the Louisiana Purchase," when most of it was not. Okay, now that's going to be renounced after the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819, but the whole idea we've been talking about, manifest destiny, that a lot of Americans see it as their God-given right to move westward and to take all that land for themselves, naturally is going to put them in territory that Mexico kind of considers its own, right? So that's going to be a big problem when it comes to, as America's moving further west, this encroachment upon land that Mexico claims for itself, which of course Texas, again, was going to be a big part of that. And so there's going to be especially increased tensions kind of in the early 1840s between John Tyler's administration and Mexico after we had, we were trying to annex Texas to make it officially a part of the United States as a state. Because again, at that moment, Texas is mostly acting as their own independent republic, but they're wanting to join the United States, which means that naturally all the baggage between Texas and Mexico is something that we're going to inherit as well. And in general, there's already a large population of Southerners who had taken their slaves to Texas. And so both Mexico and anti-slavery members of Congress opposed this. So Mexicans didn't like slavery, and then naturally your more northern members of Congress, senators, congressmen, are not going to, take kindly to Texas kind of flaunting, I should say, its slavery identity. Okay. And even though Santa Anna had surrendered, many Mexican government officials still wanted to get Texas back. And that was actually kind of a concern that some had, that no, even though Santa Anna kind of was a coward and gave it all away, and he kind of had to because he was captured by the Texans, that they're still passionate about trying to get some of that land back. So that's also a conversation being had in Mexico at that time. And so in early 1844, as President Tyler would be running for president, and again, he was the one who took over after Harrison had passed away because of pneumonia, because he couldn't wear a coat for his inauguration. Idiot, right? President Tyler brought the matter before the Senate and thought that would give him this big electoral boost. I'm trying to add Texas to the Union, kind of as he's going into election that November in 1844. However, foolishly included in his proposal some documents from Secretary of State John Calhoun, he's still around, that presented adamant defenses of slavery as a reason why we needed Texas, which is going to naturally outrage a lot of those northern congressmen who are like, we don't want another slave state in the Union. So it goes back to that issue of slavery. And so that annexation of Texas, or bringing Texas into the Union, at that moment is going to be voted down 35-16. And so this actually really hurts John Tyler's, John Tyler's, presidential reelection chances. So he thought, oh, I'll get this big boost, take this to the Senate. But quite foolishly, he included some stuff again from John C. Calhoun that were defenses of slavery to try to boost that. And the Northern Congress members are going to kind of really hate that. Okay. So, election of 1844, Tyler isn't going to run. Instead, Senator Henry Clay, he's still around as well. He's a Whig. So, again, he was kind of a, going back some years, a Republican and then a national Republican, and now he's a Whig, is going to go up against James K. Polk. Polk himself is a Democrat, okay? And Clay's going to play it safe by not really talking a lot about Texas annexation as an issue, but Polk instead, again, he's a Democrat from the South, and so he wants to kind of include as much Southern territory as possible, especially that can be slave territory. He's going to promise to not only annex Texas, but also some contested land in the Oregon territory in the Northwest as well. And he was trying to use that as saying, okay, I want to bring Texas in as a slave state, but also maybe if we bring in Oregon territory and maybe let that be a free state as a way to kind of offset any Whigs who didn't like him bringing in Texas as a state. Okay. Also, he said, hey, listen, I think I'm going to try to buy California from Mexico. So that's going to be another big thing, that California was seen as this big vaunted kind of calf that everybody wants their hands on. Okay. So due to all these big promises he makes, Polk is going to win because, as I said, his message is going to appeal to North and South. He wants to, in the South, they like that, hey, he wants to bring Texas in. And then the North were like, well, you know what? He's going to bring Oregon in as well. And so that balance of power in the Senate would stay even. So Polk is going to win. So, poor Henry Clay here. We've talked about him over the years. He's gotten close several times to maybe being president over this 20-odd year period we're talking about. And this, in some ways, was his last chance to maybe be president. It's not going to happen for him. So James K. Polk, the Democrat, now ascends to the White House. And so once he comes in, the British are going to claim Oregon as their own. There's the Oregon territory that the British said, actually, we still control that. But Polk and the Democrats are going to strongly assert, no, the U.S. has rights to all of Oregon country. Okay. And there's going to be this rallying cry known as 5440 or fight, which is saying, it's basically talking about right up here, 5440. That was basically that saying, hey, we think all this land that is in modern day Canada is ours, and we want to kind of not just take control of kind of Washington and Oregon, but also parts of Canada. Okay, so 5440 or fight, U.S. saying we need to have control of everything south of that latitude line. Now, in reality, few Americans actually were willing to fight over this territory. They were much more concerned about what was going on with Texas and Mexico. This was something that kind of was going on in such a far-flung part of the country. Many Americans didn't, frankly, really care about it. Okay, so that's what's being said in public. But behind closed doors, Polk is going to take a much more diplomatic approach and negotiate with Great Britain that the U.S. is going to receive all of Oregon country south of the 49 north latitude line, which, if you see this right here, in Oregon country was considered, part of Washington up here as well as Oregon. Okay, so all that kind of land almost at the far, kind of at the northwest corner of the country, the U.S. is going to start to take from Britain. And Britain itself was more concerned with kind of controlling Canada. So this is land that they were willing to kind of give up. And in general, at this point in the 1840s, the U.S. and Great Britain are on much better diplomatic terms. Not the best necessarily, but certainly much better than it had been in the days leading up to and even the years right after the War of 1812. Us and Britain are more willing to work together now. And so Britain's like, sure, we'll give you this land here, but we're going to keep this up here. And Polk and the U.S. go, okay, that's fair. President Tyler, before he leaves office, though, is going to push for an annexation resolution through Congress in February of 1845. He knows he's going to be out the door, and he wants to get a little bit of credit for trying to get Texas in as a state. And so Texas is going to join the Union later on that same year in 1845. Mexico's outraged by this because they know that they knew that this was probably going to happen, but this is going to be a real big kind of division line between the U.S. and Mexico. And in protest of them bringing Texas in, Mexico is going to break off all diplomatic ties with the U.S. Because U.S. and Texas are now claiming more land that was originally disputed, right? So at first, Texas said, oh, this is our territory. But now that they have the U.S. on their side, they're like, oh, you know what? Actually, we think this much territory. So knowing that the U.S. is going to support them, they're kind of claiming more than what they were really owed. And naturally, Mexico kind of sees through this and sees this as unfair. And so they're going to be outraged by this. And so this really only adds to those tensions between Mexico and the United States. Again, a lot of it prompt from us bringing Texas in as a state. So the war is going to officially kind of kick off when Polk orders General Zachary Taylor to cross the Nueces River. And that's basically right up to the line, if not a little bit past the line between the border between us and Mexico. And he was basically daring the Mexicans to technically fire the first shot so they would look like the aggressors. But think of it this way. It's like if somebody kind of, if you and your neighbor are feuding and you kind of intentionally go onto their lawn, it ain't your lawn anymore, and they fire that first shot, you're trying to egg them on or prompt them into doing that so you don't look, like you're the one that was being the aggressor. Now, hopefully they're a bad shot and they don't shoot you dead right there, so that's its own problem, right? But and so the U.S. was getting right up close to the line, if not past the line, to prompt the Mexicans to fire first so they would say, oh, see, they're attacking us. Now we can go in, right? So it was a very clear tactic. And May 9th of 1846, news comes back that Mexicans had indeed fired on Taylor's men. And Polk is going to kind of a little bit incorrectly say, in a congressional address he gives to Congress, American blood has been shed on American soil, which is not technically true. We were technically on their land, but he's going to use that to drum up a lot of support. And it's complicated because Polk himself was a Democrat, and the Whigs, the other party, are going to largely oppose the war. But they knew they had to go along with it anyways because the political momentum was so much on the side of we need to go to war with Mexico that if they stood out and said, no, we don't, then they're going to look weak and cowardly. So they don't really want to support the war, but they're like, well, we kind of have to because if we don't, we're going to, again, be called weak and cowardly. So what's the actual strategy? Taylor's troops are going to move. I got my notes over here, so I'll read a little bit. Taylor's troops are going to move south to cross the Rio Grande River, which the Rio Grande River is kind of the border of Texas right there. Cross the Rio Grande River near the Gulf of Mexico, so that's part of it. And then a separate force is going to go northwest to capture Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is an important trade center for New Mexico and the capital of New Mexico, while also taking control of California with the help of the U.S. Navy. Okay, and so U.S. forces are going to advance to Mexico City, and force a surrender. So this just really speaks to, some of the years before this, the United States had slowly started to build up its military, and it's still not as large as it was inevitably going to be. But they were, frankly, in such a position where they could kind of do these multiple angles, right? That they could kind of march south, also have the naval forces kind of go in the Gulf, even have the U.S. Navy kind of go all the way around South America and find their way over here in California, and then have another force takes New Mexico, right? So the U.S. is just much better equipped at this point to take on Mexico, and Mexico is basically playing purely a defensive strategy. So the United States is going to be in a great position to kind of win this war fairly decisively. So Congress is going to authorize Polk to call on 50,000 volunteers, and he has no trouble raising that number because almost 73,000 are going to volunteer themselves to fight in this war, okay? Now, the men themselves who are mostly signing up at this particular moment are less than ideal soldiers. They're undisciplined, they're unruly. Now, frankly, the United States had not really fought a serious war since the War of 1812. We had fought kind of smaller Native American conflicts, but we'd had a few generations pass since we'd really been at war, over 20 years about. So Again, we didn't have a tradition for some years of having a very strong military, but that's in the process of being built up, and we certainly have the resources to build one. Okay, so General Taylor is going to handily defeat Mexicans very early on against, fight Mexican forces. And Colonel Stephen W. Kearny is going to lead troops from Fort Leavenworth, which is west of Missouri, towards Santa Fe and march through a brutally dry countryside, a lot of the Great Plains, but then even going into a little bit of southwestern territory. They're going to secure the city relatively easily as Mexican forces had already abandoned the fort. And then they're going to, after they take New Mexico, lead a small force into California. But the situation in California is actually pretty interesting because there were already a lot of white settlers living in Northern California. I think I mentioned that recently in another lecture. And there's actually going to be a force led by General John C. Fremont, who's going to start an uprising before Kearny even arrives. So Kearny's kind of marching west to try to take California from Mexico. But there's already a lot of white settlers there that almost staged their own kind of little rebellion against the Mexicans before Kearny and his men even arrived. So the Mexican presence in California is pretty light because they had taken a lot of their troops and moved them south to Mexico. And that actually makes an easier victory for Fremont. And very interestingly, for a short period of time, these white settlers in California on June 4th, 1846, are actually going to declare California independent from Mexico, and they're going to rename basically that territory the Bear Flag Republic. So like Texas, California, for a very brief period of time, really for a few weeks, are actually going to kind of be their own little sovereign independent nation or republic. But then once the American troops arrive, they say, okay, yeah, we want to be a part of the United States. And so they're going to be taken in, and the United States is going to formally take possession of California. Now, Mexican leaders, they were refusing to surrender. They had lost large stretches of land, but they were still not backing down. But Polk, he wanted the very kind of classic unconditional surrender. So Polk is then going to replace Taylor, who, interestingly, these two guys would be future political rivals, with one General Winfield Scott, who's going to be a Whig. And on March of 1847, Scott and his men are going to land in Veracruz and descend upon Mexico City, which was the capital of Mexico, and engage in a very vicious, bloody battles all along the way. So, in general, this is going relatively quickly. And by September 14th of 1847, the city finally falls after a long fight, and Mexico finally does unconditionally surrender and say, okay, fine, you win. And we even are going to formally occupy Mexico for a period of time. So, as I said, even though we had, not the most disciplined men to speak of, we're going to win this war relatively quickly, relatively decisively. Why? Well, part of it is that industrial north that we had a lot more resources at our disposal. Part of it is, in general, we just have more resources to work with and compared to Mexico. Mexico, it should be said at this point, is a much younger nation. And so we have more experience under our belt and a greater case of resources. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is going to be signed on February 2nd of 1848, where Mexico is going to cede more than 500,000 square miles of land to the United States, including future states like Arizona, California, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming. So we pick up a large swath of land there, okay? And Mexico is going to agree that the Rio Grande River, which is kind of cuts at the end of Texas, is going to serve as the south border of Texas. So the Rio Grande River, even to this day, is going to basically be the Texas border, which also makes it the border between the U.S. and Mexico. And also, the U.S. is actually going to agree to pay $15 million to settle all sorts of claims of U.S. citizens against Mexico to kind of take care of all that. Okay, so really, these dreams of manifest destiny are in some roundabout way finally being realized, right? We had already taken control of kind of that northwestern Oregon country up there, which Washington and Oregon from Britain, and then which we kind of negotiated that, but then we kind of forcibly took control of this whole region here, which was a big land pickup. Again, comparable in some ways to the Louisiana Purchase in terms of the amount of land that we're taking in there, right? And we're not only picking up all this land, all these very valuable kind of, especially California, is going to be very valuable in terms of trading with Asia, right? So a lot of expanded trade possibilities with Asia, where we're not just now trading on the East Coast with Europe and parts of Africa. Now we can trade with Asia, which is a huge win for us, okay? And also in general, this little part here, the Gadsden Purchase, we actually purchased from Mexico in 1853, and that's going to be a key piece where we basically can run railroads through there as well. However, as we pick up all this new territory, slavery is still one of the biggest question marks in our nation. What role does slavery play in these Western states? Are they going to be free? Are they going to be slave? Should Congress set that, or should the people actually in those territories themselves who settle there or live there already, should they be the ones who set that? Okay. So, it's a lot of great things happening for the U.S., but a lot of questions are also popping up as well. And it should be said that there's going to be, some younger generals in this war, in particular Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant, who are getting their kind of earliest military experience. And there's Lee on the left and Grant on the right. And a lot of kind of future Civil War generals who are going to be facing off against each other kind of got some of their early crucial experience fighting here in the Mexican-American War. So the Mexican-American War is important for a variety of reasons, okay? One, we pick up a large swath of territory, right, from Mexico, and again, large parts of Texas, but even also California and a lot of those other southwestern states. Two, another big thing, as we're picking up all these territories, the questions of, how does slavery fit into this? Are these new territories going to be slave? Are they going to be free? Again, should Congress set that, or should the people who live in those territories decide that for themselves? And then also, finally, a lot of very important generals are getting their very first crack at battle that they're going to then kind of use against each other about 15 years later in the Civil War. So that's going to do it for today. As always, if you have any questions or any comments, please reach out to me and I'll be happy to help you. Take care.